Hello and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today no matter what it is you're doing. For your free wire tutorial on YouTube today, I'd like to share a technique with you which you can utilise almost any drilled bead, whether it be gemstone, resin, metal, glass, whatever you fancy. We're going to turn that into a connector. Now I'm going to show you this on the board in just a second so you can see that more closely, but it's a connector that you can use at the centre of, for instance, a choker, the centre of a bracelet, or you can strand lots of them together, and it's just a little bit more intricate than your standard rosary link connector. So I've just popped this connector that I made earlier on into the centre of a bracelet with some random green beads. And as I say, you can use any bead that you like as long as it has a drill hole that will fit the wire that you choose to use. What we're going to see is how to create a round form to highlight the bead of your choice, and then we're going to weave on either side, and it will look really quite attractive across the back of the wrist, for instance, or as the centrepiece to a choker. So we're going to be working with 1mm or 18 gauge wire for the main part of the design today, and I have two approximately 8-inch lengths here to begin with. Now that will be slightly more than we need, but you could size it up if you wanted to for a much larger bead. So the first thing that we need to do is to straighten and smooth and warm through both pieces of those wire. You'll need to have a bead in mind when you start to create this piece so that we get the sizing correct. But first and foremost, let's warm and smooth that wire so that it is ready to be worked. I have a bead that I'm going to use today, which is this sodalite, which is a faceted coin bead, and that fits nicely on my 0.4 or 26 gauge wire. So I'm going to keep that size in my mind as we move on to the next part of the tutorial, which is to find the centre of those two pieces of wire. Get that centrepiece really toasty warm so that it is as fluid as it possibly can be. And what we're going to do is use a round form that is going to be approximately the size of your bead, plus just a little extra. So I found the centre of those two lengths of wire, and I'm going to bend those wires around my round form, in this case a very old and battered wooden mandrel. You could use pretty much anything you have to hand that won't be damaged by your wire and is quite sturdy, and as I say, around about the same size. So I'm just going to draw that out of frame for a moment and see if that bead will sit in the U shapes that we've created. Probably could do with being just a tiny bit larger. So rather than reforming that, what we do is we return it to the mandrel and just push that along the mandrel slightly to open the design up, so that we know when we do bring that bead back into position, the wire always wants to attach itself to the other wire, we know that that bead is going to sit nicely and neatly in the centre with just a little bit of a gap going around the outside. So you can reform that if you need to and make it slightly larger. The next thing that we need to do is turn some right angle bends on either side of that central form that we've created. So we've created ourselves a bit of a U shape. What we want to do is to make these two pieces of wire as uniform to each other as is humanly possible. So I'm going to grip very firmly with my non-dominant hand and then turn a right angle away at the position I imagine will be about halfway along the bead. So if we measure just by using your thumbnail, for instance, you can see that that's where we're going to need to turn the angle on the side of the wire. So I'm going to very firmly grip a hold of that and turn that away at 90 degrees. Just again adding a little bit of warmth as we go, and then you can drop that bead back in to make sure that it's going to fit. I think that's probably a little bit too much space-wise, so I'm just going to draw the wire around. You could use the mandrel if you were concerned about making that shape come out of true for a moment. Just give that a little bit of a warm and push that up to make sure that we're retaining that shape. So what we're looking for is a semicircular deviation in the wire, and we're going to turn these two out to the side so it comes along, does a half a circle, and then continues on its way. So I'm going to again pinch those two wires quite firmly with my non-dominant hand, get them to line up to stack one on top of the other as much as possible, and then bring my pliers back in to turn that wire away. So I do need to make sure that that will fit around my bead. And I think probably I've made that just a tiny bit too small, which is fine because that is why we have the mandrel. So I'm going to pop those over the top, and what we're going to do is just push those along slightly so that the half circle becomes slightly larger. So if we just drop this down onto the desk, trying to keep it in 2 dimensions as much as possible, we're just going to try that bead for size. That actually looks not too bad at all. So for the moment, we're just going to put this bead out of the way before I fling it onto the floor, which is par for the course with me. For the next section of our tutorial, what we're going to do is add a little bit of your choice of figure of 8 or any other pattern weaving on either side. Now, I tend to work from the reel for this. And what I'm going to do is unspool around about 12 inches, but leaving it connected to the spool. I've got about 12 inches on my right hand side, which is my dominant side. And what we're going to do is move one of these forms out of the way for the moment. I'm going to wrap 3 times around just where that straight line comes out on the right hand side. I'm just going to give that a bit of a circle. I'm going to go for a 3 and 3. And what I'm going to do is that exact same thing, but in the rotation. So I've gone from the underside all the way around 3 times, and then my finer gauge wire with the cut end goes down the centre. We're going to add the second piece into position. Those can rotate for the time being, so don't worry if they get a little bit out of control. What I'm going to do is move that away from the angle just for a moment, because it's slightly easier for me to show you. So I've got 3 wraps on the lower of my 2 wires. The finer gauge wire has come over the top of the lower wire, down the centre. What I need to do is bring that underneath the upper of the 2 wires and draw that around 3 times. So that's 1 and 2 and 3. And then I'm just going to tighten those coils up neatly. What you can do if you need to is just very, very gently splay the ends so that they're slightly opening when you have the circle in formation. So again, pinching with my non-dominant hand, you could do whatever kind of weaving you want to see on the finished piece. In the example, I've used a heavier gauge wire just to make it easier for you to see. I also used 2 colours of wire. So we're just going to weave. This is a 2 and 2 basket weave, but I'm going to create now with a 3 and 3 basket weave. So I've wrapped 3 times around the upper wire, down the centre, underneath the lower wire. So I'm going to now wrap 3 times around the lower wire. So that's 1, that's 2, that's 3, down the centre. And then what we're going to do is continue along a good while. So I'm just going to pause you for the moment and come back to you once I've done a little bit more weaving. So I've just done probably about 8 wraps on each side of 3 coils every time. So if you'd like to join me back down at the board, I'll show you what to do next. So you can see that I'm connected on the left here, and I've got a small tail over on the right. So what I need to do is to trim the small tail away in between those 2 wires as much as I possibly can. And that means that end piece, we'll just tidy that down as much as we can, keeps out of mischief as much as possible. Interloper on the board, excuse me guy, thank you. There we go. So what I'm going to do now is show you how to just flip this over, so that we're moving onto the other side, and in this way you'll waste less wire in the long run. What you will notice is that you can move the weave up and down ever so slightly, so you could bring this slightly closer to those angles we created if you want to. However, if you want to fill the gap, what we're going to do is make sure that we have 3 wraps visible on the what is now upper wire. We're just going to open this out very, very gently, and then we're going to fill in the gap. So that's 1 and 2 and 3. You could start very close to those angles if you prefer, but I just want to have the opportunity to show you how you can reduce wire wastage if you wish to. What I would say is that all small pieces of wire are useful in the long run. We're going to continue all the way down until we have filled that gap completely. So it doesn't take terribly long, it just can be a little bit repetitive if you've seen it all before. 2 and 3, and then I think we'll finish off with 3 wraps on the top. 1 and 2 and 3. I'm just going to draw that down in the centre. So you can see we're still connected to the spool. What I'm going to do is free off around about 12 inches and trim the wire away from the spool now. The reason that I'm going to do this is because it means I can make my design seamlessly with a single length of fine wire. If you struggle with this being in the way whilst you're undertaking the next part of the tutorial, you can simply cut this off here, again in between those 2 wires and as neatly as possible. Start on the other side, do your weaving, and then we're going to do the next part, which is to create the connector loops. So what you can do is set the gemstone and then do your rotation. So 3 on the bottom, 3 on the top, until you have a similar amount of weaving on both sides. It may be easier if you are slightly newer to wire work to just trim this away, and then we will add more wire in later. What I want to show you is how to create the looped part of the design. Let me just grab the demonstration piece. So you can see we've got coils on both sides, which means that its front and back are identical, so you can just wear this any which way, and if it does flip whilst you are wearing it, it doesn't look unattractive in any way. On this design I added the bead in later with a separate section of wire, so that's what it looks like. You just get a few extra coils of wire just on the outside circle of that central design. But if you don't want to have that, I'm going to show you now how to create one of these little connecting loops. So I'm going to pull this out of the way and just very, very carefully wrap it around the tail, so hopefully it won't get too much in the way, unlike my hand and the camera. So what I want to do is just make sure that this is nice and flat. I don't want to hammer it, but I do want to just roll it down and make sure that it's nice and smooth. I'm also just going to double check that my bead does still indeed fit inside, and it does, even with a little bit of a gap. So what I want to do now is to show you how to create the loop section on this side. What I might do actually is just set the bead and then we'll work with it. So again, you could, if you wanted to, trim the wire away and worry about adding the bead later, but I'm going to show you how to do that in one shot. So let's grab that Sodalite bead, slip that through the drill hole. Again, this is the 0.4 or 26 wire. And just get that to sit as close and as neatly as possible. So on the left hand side, my finer gauge wire is coming over the top in the top left corner. So in order for the bead to sit centrally, that central wire needs to travel through the bead and go from top left to bottom right. Now it's up to you whether you want that to go from the top to the top. If you do that, your bead will sit much more evenly. If you're a stickler for symmetry and patterns, you may wish to take the wire underneath and set it like so. What this means is that your bead will have a slight tilt to it. So my preference would be to have the bead sitting completely flat. So I'm going to take it from the top left to the bottom right. I'm going to pinch that with my non-dominant hand, open out the design ever so slightly and run the wire 3 times around the lower of those 2 long tail wires coming away. So I've got 3 visible wraps now. I'm just going to tighten that up neatly and let's have a look at how that's sitting. That's working for me. You can make that a slightly different form and shape if you want to. You could make them exact semicircles. This is slightly oval, so it's up to you whether that bothers you or not. It doesn't bother me one little bit. So my wire has come around the lower, my finer gauge wire has come around the lower of the 2 heavier gauges, up the centre, so now I need to wrap it 3 times around the upper of those 2 wires. So 1 and 2. 3rd time, finer gauge wire comes up the centre between the 2 heavier wires. Get that nice and neatly into position, and then because we've done our 3 wraps on the top row, on the top wire rather, we need to now wrap 3 times on the lower wire. So I'm just going to do that once, 1, 2 and 3. And what you would need to do now is to continue for the same number of wraps or a similar distance as you did on the first side. So I've simply given the 3 and 3 weave the same number of rolls around those core wires on the right hand side as I did on the first side. So if you'd like to join me back down at the board, I'll show you what that looks like now. So I've got a similar length of weaving on either side of that central bead, and as I say, if it troubles you in any way, you can simply trim away the wires on either end of those woven sections, and you can add the bead at a later date. If you are newer to wire work, that may be your preference anyway. So the next part of the tutorial is going to be exactly the same thing on both sides. So I'm just going to show you on the one side. I'm going to pop my flat bent chain nose pliers over the top of that woven section. Now for this I am applying very little pressure. It's very, very gentle movement. And what we're going to do is turn that away at an angle so that it comes up from the design, and it's just on those bends that we made off the side of the circular form. So the next thing that we need to do is to create a round shape in that woven segment. Now if you have a bail maker, then you can absolutely use your bail making pliers to do this, but a small round form of any kind is adequate. So I'm just going to roll that around so that the woven section comes back to the same position. We've got weaving starting here, weaving ending here. Once I've got that round section into position, I'm going to open that out ever so slightly, because I know now where the round section needs to be. For this part, it really does help having very toasty warm hands. So I'm going to put as much heat as I possibly can, especially in this first part of the wire which has no weaving on. So we're going to make that super flexible, and you can see with the bead in situ, it's not an issue because it does spin at the moment. Once I've heated that wire through, I'm going to take the right hand, as we look at it like so. The right hand wire is going to the right of the bead through the centre of that round form. Before we tighten that up, we need to get the left hand wire doing the exact same thing on the left hand side. So heating the wire is really super important at this stage. So you can see that they're starting to just curve their way through at the moment. A little bit of extra heat, and what we want to do is to achieve the woven section meeting the woven section. So we're just going to push those through as best we can until that sits back, and you can see that the round form we created, slightly misshapen, but it's still there, and we did that with those bail making pliers. So once we have those coming through and the woven section meeting the woven section, what we're going to do is to try and get that to happen again, but without losing the weave meeting the weave. So again, I'm just going to put a little bit more heat through the wire, especially just here where the action's taking place. Push the tail all the way through. Now you might at this stage need to use your pliers just to get quite a tight bend in there. And I'd like to get that to go through one more time if I can. So I'm just going to use my pliers, and having fine tipped bent chain nose pliers is really helpful at this stage. So I'm just going to push that through, pull the tail through, and then tighten that loop up as much as possible. So you can get right in there and give that a good old squeeze. And then I'm just going to straighten up this wire while it still has an element of warmth to it, because I want that to be nice and fluid for in a moment. On the other side, we need to do the exact same thing, and then we'll repeat on the opposite side of the coin. So I will show you just one more time from the other side this time. So we get a nice tight bend to begin with. Allow that coin to rotate if you put that in position already. If you didn't, it's just easier. I'm just going to warm that wire through before we poke the tail through the gap again. Draw that up and around so that we can get that nice and neat and tight as much as possible. Now for one of these wires, it's going to come through another time so that it sits over on one side of the coin. The other wire will be going in the opposite direction, so one will wrap 1.5 times around that round circular form, and one will wrap 2 times around the circular form. What we're looking for is to have a wire on either side, basically. So if I give that a really good warm through now, it's done a lot of work, it's getting a little bit tense. So the next thing that we are going to do is to trim these to equal lengths, and I would say around about 1 inch is adequate, using the flush side of your cutters. And you need to trim them when they're both in their final position, so one going one way, one going the other way, both to be the same length. Now what we're going to do is to coil these and have them sitting over just the beginning of the face of that bead, and that will stop the bead from spinning when it's finally sitting in there when you're completely done. Now, in order to make your life easy, doing the second little section, this section that we've just done together, I would leave these sticking out until the last minute, purely because it means that you can still rotate the bead and it's easier to get these tails through. Once you've got the second half done, you can add those coils on and you'll lock your coin bead into position. So we now need our round nose pliers. And what we're going to do is to pop a coil over the face of the bead on both sides. So start by round nose pliers, just getting a little coil going, and then we're going to draw that down. It doesn't have to be a massive coil to be effective. And then we're just going to sit that down over the face of the bead. So it doesn't look like it's going to do much until you add the second one into position. So let's get that second one going. Again, small movements with making coils will make for a neater coil in the end. Rotate a couple of times until you get the start of a coil. Tricky to show you when the camera's focused lower down. So we're just going to rotate, rotate, rotate until we get that coil into position. And then what you can do is just draw that down over the face of the bead. So what I might do, in fact, is just draw that slightly past and flip it over. I think that will look nicer. So what will happen when you create your second woven loop on the far side, you'll have a coil on the face of the bead on both sides at both ends, and that will stop the bead from spinning around. Like I said, I would definitely do that second half before you trap your coin bead into position, purely because it means that you have slightly better access when you're creating those tight movements just at the neck of the design. So I hope that you've enjoyed today's tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you back here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel again very, very soon. Take care and bye for now.